Begin recording. And I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight on the first night of our two-part series on trauma-informed education. I'm Janelle Skurlock. I'm the Sublette BOCES Executive Director. Thanks everyone for coming. I'd like to just quickly introduce Simran Burt. She's going to also give you some background on herself, but she is an academic manager and counselor at the Good Counsel Learning Center in Mankato, Minnesota. She also trains and presents to universities and higher education institutions across the whole country. We're pretty lucky to have her with us tonight. You know, we're pretty thankful that trauma is finally being validated in our culture as affecting the way we live our lives. And so I feel like probably all of us are here tonight just to really learn from her and be able to support those that we love and work with in dealing with trauma. This is a live Zoom, as you guys know, so if you would please put your questions and comments in the chat. I believe she'll have a question and answer session at the end where she can address those questions and concerns. And please make sure to keep yourself muted. And other than that, I would like to turn it over to Simran, and I'd also like to give my colleague Heidi Rainey a shout out for getting this organized and getting Simran to join us tonight. So I hope you all enjoy and take it away.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome. I'm really excited to be here with you and have this opportunity to share with you without the hassle of driving across the country or flying. So I'm really excited for tonight. So like I said, my name is Simran Burt, and I'm the academic director at Good Counsel Learning Center in Mankato, Minnesota. And a little bit about the organization that I work at. It is a community-based organization, and we provide one-on-one tutoring and instruction to youth in grades K through 12, as well as adults. We primarily serve immigrants, refugees, and their children. We provide a lot of literacy instruction, as well as some math help and citizenship instruction. So we do a lot at our organization. We also have a really robust referral system with Minnesota Council of Churches and other nonprofits to help our students meet their clothing, food, shelter, and legal needs. Oh, we have a fellow Minnesotan here. So happy to see you. Yes, welcome, welcome. All right. So I will give you all a little bit of a warning. I am presenting from home, and I do have 3 cats. So they may make a surprise appearance. And so I ask that you just give them the adoration that they so desire and deserve. All right, so at the conclusion of this session, over the course of the 2 days, participants should be able to define trauma, identify the effects and symptoms and core experiences of trauma exposure, define safety in the context of trauma-informed practices, respond compassionately and effectively using the regulate, relate, reason, neurosequential heuristic, and develop and implement resiliency routines. So what that essentially means is I will walk you through some of the trauma 101, talking about trauma is, what the effects that we'll see on our students and staff, and then moving away from definitions and into solutions and things that we can do to help. So before we begin, I want to take a few seconds to just get everybody regulated. So we're kind of starting at the same psycho-emotional cognitive space. So before we begin, let's take a few minutes to ground ourselves in this experience that we're having here together by regulating our breathing and attention. So I have a GIF over on the right-hand side of the screen. So go ahead and breathe in as the GIF expands and out as it shrinks. Now, granted, you probably needed that regulation more than I did, as I'm the one that's presenting and I'm the one that's scared to death. But I think this is a valuable way to start all sessions with other individuals, and we'll talk more about that later. I also want to take a chance to get to relate to you a little bit. So taking a look at this image I have, on a scale of 1 to 9 in cat, How are you doing today? Go ahead and put a number in the chat and let me know how you're feeling. I would say that I am definitely at a 4. Mike is a 5, Cassandra is a 1. Oh, and we're another 4. All right. 7, 5. Jess, since you're a 7 and that 7 looks a little bit rough, I may come back and check on you a little bit later. All right, 8s. Any 9s out there? Anybody drinking some Jose today while we're doing this? Okay, all right. All right, so it looks like a lot of people are feeling like pretty positive cats out there. I'm glad to hear that. For those of you that are checking in at 7 or 8s, maybe I'll circle back around and check on you to hope that you're doing a little bit better later. All right, so I will introduce myself and tell you more about me in a second, but I want to take a little bit of time to get to know about you. Specifically, I want to know where you're joining us from, what your role is, and what brought you to this session today. So feel free to put your replies in the chat or unmute and go ahead and answer verbally.
I'm Mike Williams. I'm the director of the BOCES in Evanston, and we run a dropout recovery program. And for the last 3 or 4 years, I've been teaching about the effects on trauma and ways that these kids who have left public high school, most of them had trauma of some kind, not all of them, but most of them have. And I go over ways that they can combat the things that got them where they're at and move forward in a more healthy lifestyle.
Great, thank you.
I'm Tessa Miller. I'm the volunteer and violence prevention coordinator for the Sublette County Sexual Assault and Family Violence Task Force. Many of my volunteers are on this as well. So you'll see a lot of SAFV popping up maybe in the feed. We obviously deal with survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. So the more we can learn about trauma and how that shows itself with the clients that we have here in the office that call into the helpline, the better I think we are as advocates. So, yeah.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I'm seeing some SAFV volunteers and advocates in the comments as well. So I'm really glad to have you here. Thank you for the work you do and thank you for attending today. I can't wait to hear we have to contribute. All right. So feel free to contribute in the chat. And as I'm talking, I have the chat open right in front of me. So if you have questions as I'm talking, feel free to type a question into the chat box and I will circle around to it as quickly as I can. After each section of the presentation, I'll also have opportunities for discussion and questions as well too. So we'll take it piece by piece. Great, lots of people fascinated by the trauma brain. Excellent, good. Well, I'm so glad that all of you are here and that we have this common interest, that we share this interest. So a little bit about me to start. My name is Cimarron Burt. I use they, them, theirs pronouns as well as she, her interchangeably. The first thing I'll tell you about myself is that my ACE score is 7 out of 15. If that's something that you're not familiar with, we will talk a little bit more about that later. But this is just to tell you that when I come to you to talk about trauma, I'm coming to you from both a professional research perspective as well as a personal perspective as someone who has survived traumatic experiences and tried to be part of learning communities as well. A little bit more about me. During the summers, I'm a faculty member at the International Music Camp Summer School of Fine Arts in Manitoba, Minnesota. That's really exciting as I was a camper there as a child. So I get to return as a faculty member and that's just so great, so cool. I also work at Good Counsel Learning Center, which I referenced. Prior to stepping in as academic director last year, I was an upper level writing instructor for 5 years. In 2017, I graduated from Minnesota State University here in town in Mankato with my Master's of Fine Arts in Creative Writing, as well as a certificate of teaching writing from the same university. Prior to that, I got my bachelor's in English at St. Cloud State University. And prior to that, I grew up in rural northeastern North Dakota. So even though I'm quite the dazzling urbanite now, I grew up in a really rural area. And so some of the challenges and obstacles that you might face with your students and some of the circumstances that you are experiencing being rural as well, I have a really deep understanding of that. And this here are a few pictures of me just in various contexts with different students. You'll also see me using a Bitmoji throughout the presentation as well too. So the first thing I want to start with is defining trauma. There are many different ways to define trauma. It's kind of a nebulous term, very hard to pin down. But I want to start with this. That way, throughout the course of these 2 sessions of the next 2 days, that we're all working from the same definition of what trauma is. So when I talk about trauma, I talk about it in 2 parts. So the first part of trauma is the actual experience, the physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening experience. So that is the moment you have, that traumatizing moment. The second part of trauma, as we are going to talk about it in this context, is the lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So trauma is not only the event, it's all of the negative sequelae that come after the event. So in the case here with Humpty Dumpty, he's actually a really, really great example of what trauma looks like. Is the traumatic moment for Humpty Dumpty would have been falling off the wall. But the trauma also involves the fact that he can't be put back together again. That something is fundamentally different about him afterwards. Not to say that he's broken, but he's not the same Humpty Dumpty he was before the experience. And so when we talk about trauma, really thinking of it as a dividing event that divides the individual's life into a before and an after. And when we talk about the trauma, we're not talking about just the event, but everything that comes after it. So it's big term. When we talk about trauma, we often measure it or discuss it in terms of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. In 1998 was the first original ACEs study. And what that did is it measured the different kinds of adversity that children are up against, and subsequent studies were done following these children to see what the effects of these trauma were. This original study identified a number of adverse childhood experiences, including abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. The types of physical abuse that they talked about were physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. A form of trauma can also be neglect, physical or emotional neglect. And household dysfunction can also consider mental illness of a parent or caregiver or someone in the household, an incarcerated relative, a mother or a parent treated violently. So witnessing domestic violence can be a form of trauma. Being exposed to substance abuse or experiencing substance abuse personally is a form of trauma. And watching your parents divorce or being part of a divorce proceeding can also be traumatic as well. This original study, this 1998 study, one of the main limitations of it, but worth noting, is that it only looked at individuals, primarily white individuals from upper and middle class income. And so when we were looking at the types of trauma, it was very, very limited in some ways, and didn't take into consideration the full gamut of trauma. A number of years later, in 2013, they did another major ACEs study, again, looking at adverse childhood experiences and the long-term effects. And the Philadelphia ACE survey actually built upon the original ACEs survey. Like I mentioned, the original ACEs survey was limited by race and class. This new ACEs survey included much more demographics, a wider diversity of individuals, including several individuals from the Philadelphia area, of course, which has a really high impoverished population, a really high African-American population as well. So in addition to the original ACEs from the 1998 study, the 2013 study added a couple of more adverse childhood experiences that perhaps aren't so common for those upper and middle class white individuals, but do not nevertheless occur in other contexts. So some of those adverse childhood experiences that were added were witnessing violence, not just domestic violence, but violence in the streets or elsewhere. If they asked if individuals had ever felt discrimination, which is a form of trauma, we talk about systemic racism, systemic discrimination. We also have additional criteria of adverse neighborhood experiences. So asking individuals, growing up, did you feel safe in your neighborhood? Did you feel people in your neighborhood looked out for each other, stood up for each other, and could be trusted? So looking not just at interpersonal and personal trauma, but expanding the scope to include communities as well. This new study also looked at individuals' history at being bullied, which many of us can attest is a traumatic experience, even though it wasn't included on the original criteria. And the final criteria they added to this new ACEs survey is if the child had lived in foster care. So with the addition of these extra adverse childhood experiences, there are 15 ACEs total. So at the beginning of the presentation, when I said that my ACE score was 7 out of 15, that means that in childhood, I experienced 7 out of these 15 adverse childhood experiences. And as we go on, we'll talk more about that and what that means for individuals who have experienced that. Again, with the Philadelphia study, that expanded our definition of adverse childhood experiences and trauma to not just the personal, but the interpersonal, and looking at those larger settings outside of the home, looking at community and organizations. So we talk about adverse community environments. Oftentimes there's a huge relationship between the types of personal traumas that we endure one-on-one and the things happening in our larger community. And we see that there's a lot of interplay between the two. So oftentimes adverse community environments and experiences can include widespread poverty in a community disruption. A great example of this is up here in the Twin Cities. When they built 94, they actually built the interstate through a primarily Black neighborhood and created a lot of displacement for those individuals. And so community disruption, that can also apply to individuals who are immigrants, refugees, whose homes and communities have been fundamentally disrupted. Another adverse community environment can also be a lack of opportunity, economic mobility, and social capital. So just those situations and that environment that individuals live in. We also have those adverse experiences of violence, discrimination, and poor housing quality and affordability. It can also be said that simply falling below a certain poverty line, it can be in and of itself traumatic as well. And so those larger community traumas often feed into and create and contribute to these smaller personal traumas, such as emotional and sexual abuse, substance abuse, domestic violence, depression, neglect, mental illness, incarceration, homelessness, and divorce. So we see there's a constant relationship between these types of adverse experiences where they perpetuate each other and they continue to perpetuate harm through each other. One frame of reference that's useful for talking about ACEs is the different realms that they can occur in. So where the trauma is happening. And the first realm is within the household or within the family. Again, looking at things like divorce, homelessness, parental or sibling mental illness, sexual abuse, domestic violence. These are all traumas that occur in immediate circumstances, in the home, and what we would consider, primary or first spaces. We see from there, we also have the elements of community trauma, which in addition to the things we talked about, can include food scarcity, lack of jobs, substandard schools and education, poor water quality and air quality, historical trauma, generational trauma, as well as substandard wages. So there are a lot of economic elements to community trauma. And the third, more recent realm of trauma that we talk about is environmental trauma. Whether or not you are engaging with the conversation around climate change, there are a number of natural disasters and crises that can occur in the natural world that can create trauma for individuals, such as record heat and droughts, wildfires, storms, sea level rise, which can lead to displacement of communities and creates a refugee crisis, tornadoes and hurricanes, volcanoes, tsunamis, earthquakes, and pandemics. So those big natural, quote unquote, acts of God that are really disruptive and destructive for individuals can also be a huge source of trauma as well. So when we talk about trauma and where it occurs, a really useful schematic for that is the window of tolerance. So oftentimes at the top and bottom, we have these bars, and the top bar represents hyper arousal, when you're really worked up, thinking of too much is going on, overstimulation, being overwhelmed. And we have below the bottom bar where you are understimulated, nothing is going on. Maybe you're shut down, maybe you don't have access to stimulating activities. And so when you fall below or above that window of tolerance, it creates a negative and difficult experience. You're experiencing intense emotions, you're usually in an intense environment. And so that window of tolerance, that green line that we're going to see a couple of times throughout the course of this presentation, really represents the ideal place for emotional functioning. We don't like to think about ourselves as like moods on a roller coaster. And this is what that represents, is that for individuals in healthy environments, their day-to-day is regular, it's routine. They're not feeling exceptionally stressed at any given point or for a long period of time, or they're not feeling particularly overwhelmed. They're feeling well-regulated, they're feeling in control. And so I like to maintain that window of tolerance. And so when people are having experiences and living life within their window of tolerance, they're not experiencing trauma. They may be experiencing difficulty, but they're not experiencing trauma. So we talk about the different types of trauma. What that ties back to is how the traumatic incident relates to the window of tolerance. So there are two types of trauma that we're going to kind of focus in on today. And the first is simple or single incident trauma, or type 1. And that's a single isolated event that occurs in the context of relative emotional and physical safety. So when we talk about trauma, PTSD, a lot of people think of things like combat, sexual assault, car accidents. Those would be types of type 1 trauma, where you have something shocking and disruptive occurring in an otherwise safe, regular, and normal context. And we see that represented in this pink line here. The majority of the individual's experiences are falling within that window of tolerance, but here we see a dip into understimulation, checking out, and we see some rises and falls outside of the window of tolerance, indicating that that individual being mapped there is experiencing some sort of emotional distress, something very significant. The second type of trauma is known as complex trauma. And this is where the exposure to the traumatic circumstances or incidents are multiple, and they're chronic or inescapable. And that means that the environment itself is a source of toxic stress as opposed to a single event. So when we talk about complex trauma, we talk about victims, we're looking at victims of sex trafficking or individuals who have endured long-term domestic violence or sexual abuse and neglect, where the trauma is actually the norm for them instead of the rare event that's occurring. And that's represented in this red line, where we see that this individual's experiences are mostly are on the high end of the window of tolerance. So this person is regularly having intolerable, unbearable, excruciating experiences that they are not equipped to handle emotionally, physically, or mentally. And this creates a very different type of trauma, this long-term constant exposure as well. So just a quick summary on defining trauma. When we talk about trauma from this point forward, trauma is going to be a negative experience, its resulting physical and emotional injury, and the long-term effects of the exposure. So both the event and the things that come after the event. Trauma exposure is often measured in terms of adverse experiences. So a higher ACEs score usually indicates more exposure to trauma. In regard to those ACEs, there are 3 realms of adverse experiences. There's individual, community, and environmental. So the 3 locations from which trauma can occur and come from. These 3 realms are not separate, they're very much interrelated. And then there are 2 types of trauma exposure. We have the simple trauma, a single shocking event within an otherwise normal context, or we have complex trauma, where the exposure to unbearable circumstances was chronic and ongoing. All right, so I'm going to set a timer for 3 minutes, and I'd like to use this time for you to go ahead and ask any questions in the chat you have, any comments, if you'd like to do any sharing about maybe your own definition of trauma or where you've seen some of this come into play. I just want to mute my microphone and give some of you space to join in verbally or via chat. I would also be interested to hear if anybody has any other definitions of trauma or has anything they'd like to add to the definition that we're using. Tessa says, my clients bring a lot of trauma with them. Yeah.
I don't think in like rural areas, we think of community trauma.
Mhm.
I think when I hear that term, I think more of an urban environment, but I think it happens a lot more than small towns want to talk about.
Mhm. Mhm.
So trying to break down the silence about that is challenging and tricky.
Yeah, Tessa, that's a great point. A lot of people tend to think that some of these ACEs as location bound or time bound or generation bound. And they're not. Anybody of any ilk, of any background can experience any of these traumas if the circumstances are wrong or right. Yeah. And I would agree. I would say that rural communities definitely do have equal community trauma to urban ones, if not more. Yeah, thank you for making that point. Mike says, first time I have been exposed to the additional 5 ACEs. Okay, good. Yeah, the first time I heard about it in a presentation about 6 months ago was the first time I'd heard about it. Sharing your score on visitors who led a successful life, which used to amaze me considering where I came from with trauma. Yes, same. Ooh, no, stop. Okay. All right. Sorry, I forgot to turn the volume off on that alarm, and then I scared the bejeebus out of myself. All right. Yeah, it was apparent that my home of origin led to my outward success. Yeah, and we're going to talk a little bit about that growth mindset as well too. You know, obviously there's a lot of negativity that come out of trauma exposure, but there's a lot of growth and promise as well that comes for survivors. Okay, so now that we have a working definition of trauma, we're going to take a look at the symptoms of trauma exposure as well as the long-term effects. So trauma can affect us before we're even born. The effects of trauma can start to reach us as soon as conception, as soon as we start to physically develop, and can follow us into death. So prior to conception, we have ideas of trauma coming in terms of generational embodiment and historical trauma. That is the trauma that your people, your family has endured. So as a Jewish individual, the burden of generational trauma that I carry is pretty obvious. Within recent memory, we had the Holocaust, the Shoah, and a long history of anti-Semitism. And so before I was even born, before I was even a sparkle in my father's eye, that was something that was guaranteed that I would have to reckon with once I came into the world. We also have the social conditions and local context. So, you know, where you grew up, what your hometown was like, you know, even before you come into the world, that scene has already been set. And then once you're born and you come into the world, that's where you start to experience the adverse childhood experiences of your own, where you start to develop and build and collect your own trauma. We also have disrupted neurodevelopment. So as you get older, there are a number of things that can disrupt neurodevelopment. Puberty is a big one and can be traumatic for some of us. Sometimes nutritional deficiencies or other deficiencies developed through community trauma can lead to disrupted neurodevelopment. A number of factors, but those are also things that can contribute to trauma, stem from trauma, and create trauma. We also have the social, emotional, and cognitive impairment of trauma exposure, which we're really going to dig into today as well. So those are the ways that trauma exposure, affects your day-to-day, your lived life, and your quality of life. Following that, we have the adoption of health risk behavior. So we know that individuals with high ACEs scores tend to develop substance abuse issues as well as cardiovascular disease as well. And a lot of this cardiovascular disease risk comes from, again, increased substance use, poor habits, things that may be born out of these negative symptoms of trauma. As a result of this adoption of health risk behaviors, by taking on risky behaviors, it starts to negatively impact your health. So if you have developed a substance abuse issue, that can eventually create liver disease and other types of disease for you. So some of these health risk behaviors can cause long or short-term disability, as well as social problems and social mobility. And then if we see if this disease, disability, and these social problems are left unchecked, they can lead to premature death as well. So not only are the effects of trauma really severe, but trauma is really inescapable. It is not something that we can do anything to prevent. Oftentimes because the scene has been set before we were even born for a number of these types of traumas. So I want to start off by talking about the biological symptoms of trauma exposure. So trauma exposure, or traumatic experiences, or trauma exposure, or chronic stress, so more like that type 2 trauma, the ongoing toxicity, can cause permanent chemical and structural changes to the brain and other organ systems. This is something I cannot stress enough. Trauma exposure causes structural changes to the brain. It changes your physiology. It changes who you physically are as a person. And so that's really important for us to understand, because trauma-informed critical pedagogy, the basis of a lot of this work that I do, is rooted in that understanding of how trauma affects brain development. If we understand how trauma affects the brain development, that guides the teacher in implementing modifications that set students up for success. So that's why it's so imperative to understand some of the biological effects of trauma. So we will talk a little bit about whole body health, but we're really going to be focusing on the brain a lot. Especially as an educator, that's where a lot of my energy is focused, educational psychology and things like that. So taking a look at this diagram of the brain, I'm going to kind of walk you through what parts of the brain are affected by trauma exposure, and specifically how. So one of the main things that we will run into is that trauma exposure in many parts of the brain will cause decreased volume. So these parts of the brain actually atrophy, shrink, and grow smaller over time. So trauma exposure is linked to not brain death, but brain shrinkage. So again, physical structural changes that we can see on a PET scan, on a CT scan. So in the corpus callosum, which is kind of in the core of your brain, if you stuck your fingers in your ears and went all the way through, it would hurt and you would find it. Maltreated children and adolescents, so that especially that early in life trauma creates a decreased volume in the corpus callosum. And this is the largest white matter structure in your brain. This is the part of your brain that controls the communication between right and left, between logic and art, spatial and verbal. So if that part of your brain has decreased in volume, it obviously goes to follow that you will struggle with those tasks that involve hemispheric communication. We know that abuse that occurs later in life and for adolescents and adults, those who were neglected as children, they have a smaller prefrontal cortex, so the part of your brain right behind your forehead. And this part of your brain is what regulates behavior, cognition, and emotional regulation. So individuals with decreased volume here are going to have trouble controlling their behavior, controlling difficulty performing certain cognitive tasks, difficulty controlling their own emotions. So individuals that have effects to the brain in this part of the brain, in the prefrontal cortex, these are often what are identified as problem students. We also know that the amygdala, which is usually somewhere behind the ear, abuse and neglect can cause overactivity in the amygdala. So instead of a decrease in volume, we can see an increase in volume and an increase in capacity. And the amygdala is what tells your brain, was what part of what controls fear. And so with an overactive amygdala, your brain struggles to determine between a genuine threat and a non-genuine threat. And so when your amygdala is not working properly, it's very hard for you to understand and recognize safe situations. We also know that here on the hippocampus, adults who were maltreated, this occurs even if you were maltreated as an older adult, you can have reduced volume in the hippocampus. And for us that serve as educators or work in learning communities, this is especially pertinent because the hippocampus is really the part of the brain that's central to working memory, long-term memory, and those learning processes. So when toxic stress is exposed to the brain, or the brain is exposed to toxic stress, we find a dysregulation of cortisol levels. And so again, these students are, one, unable to perform basic cognitive tasks because that part of their brain has shrunk, or is just simply too busy being afraid. And the last structural change we see in the brain is that maltreated children and adolescents have decreased volume in the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is very, very important for motor function. Sometimes as individuals get older, they will develop that little head wobble or handshakes. And a lot of times those are caused by dysfunction in the cerebellum. And so what not a lot of people recognize is that while trauma can have emotional and mental effects, it can also have physical effects. It can cause tremor and issues with motor function, motor activity, and executive dysfunction. So when we think about the brain, maybe you've heard the term lizard brain before, but essentially brains developed over the course of evolution and time from the bottom up and from the back to the front. So we're talking about this part of the brain down here. We're talking about a more primitive part of the brain where more basic functions occur. And as we work our way up through the brain, the functions become more complex and the processes become more complex. So when we're down here in the brainstem, this is the most basic part of your brain. This is the brain that all animals share. And this is the part of the brain that is responsible for fight, flight, or freeze. So the really basic functions to keep you alive. You can't control the things that happen in your brainstem. they control you. We move up into the diencephalon. Yes. And that's a little bit higher in the brain. And that part of the brain is where we come into more flight. So when we talk about fight, flight, or freeze, fight is the first response. Your first response is to fight. And if you cannot win that fight, you move to a higher part of your brain where you go into flight or freeze. You try to find a different way to escape the situation. So the mental processes are more complex, but still largely beyond our control or our cognition. So when an individual is in the part of their brain, the diencephalon, we're going to see things like reactive cognition, where they're only able to react to things in the environment. Or if they move up a little bit, we may see compliance or emotional cognition. So again, these students aren't fully functioning logically, but they are more, these individuals, but they are more with us. These processes are more and more advanced. When we move higher up into the brain, into the limbic system, this is the part of the brain that controls vigilance or awareness, controls whether or not we choose to avoid a situation. The limbic system also determines whether or not we are able to take in new information. So if you are still in the alarm, fear, and terror parts of your brain, the diencephalon and the brainstem, you are unable to take in new information. You are unable to memorize things, you're unable to learn things, and you're often unable to communicate effectively. And then once we move up to the highest part of the brain, the neocortex, the new cortex, the newest part of the brain. This is the part of the brain that makes us, quote unquote, human. And when this part of your brain is engaged, you're able to rest, have reflective thoughts. This is where you're really at your sharpest, able to commit new information to long-term memory. Working memory is working at its fullest capacity. And you're also able to use abstract thought as well too. So again, as we move up through the brain from the less primitive parts, from the primitive parts to the more advanced parts, we see increased function and increased engagement from individuals. And so those biological changes, those structural changes in the brain will lead to other types of changes. So the primary type of change that we talk a lot about in these circles are the psychological changes that individuals with trauma exposure experience. So exposure to adverse experiences and trauma is closely linked to decreased attention, memory, and cognition. And if you're an educator or you work in learning communities, those are the big three that you have to remember. That when you're working with traumatized individuals, you will often see deficits or difficulties with attention, memory, and cognition. And again, it's important to keep that in mind. PTSD, which again, PTSD does not necessarily come from trauma exposure. It is its own separate thing. So it is possible to have exposure to trauma and not be diagnosed with PTSD or CPTSD. So trauma exposure and PTSD are not interchangeable terms. And that's why I do not use them as such. But for individuals who have been clinically diagnosed with PTSD, there is a really high rate of comorbidity or co-occurrence. So individuals with PTSD are also diagnosed with anxiety, depression, and borderline personality disorder. So not only are they living with the experience of their trauma, but there are also other complicating psychological factors as well too. So oftentimes from psychological difficulties and disturbances, we'll see issues or problems with behavior. And that's because emotional dysregulation is a hallmark experience of trauma. Again, when we're talking about those parts of the brain, emotional regulation is a very advanced process for our brains. The ability to control our emotions, to experience our emotions in a healthy way and communicate them, that's really advanced stuff. And so when we're in the throes of fear and anxiety, and we're not in that highest part of our brain, we're not able to regulate our emotions as effectively. And from that emotional dysregulation often comes, again, quote unquote, problem behaviors. So some of the behaviors resulting from biological hyperarousal include irritability, fidgeting, and chattiness. So hyperarousal is the part of the line that flies above the window of tolerance. This is when a student's brain is going, or individual's brain is going 1,000 miles an hour, click, 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 click. These individuals have a hard time sitting still, right? If your brain is racing, your body wants to follow suit. And so these are the students you see that are sitting in the classroom like this and fidgeting and flipping their pens and things like that, because they're experiencing hyperarousal. There's too much juice, too much anxiety going through their brain at that time. We're seeing increased activity in the amygdala. On the other side of that, we can have hypoarousal, which is when the brain is not fully engaged enough. And that can manifest as inattention. So students spacing out, students falling asleep in class, and just generally being lethargic and unenthusiastic. And so what that results from is, instead of the brain trying to solve the problems by moving 100 miles an hour, essentially the brain just turns off and says, we're not going to deal with any of this right now. And you can see how that manifesting in a classroom or an office environment could be really problematic and frustrating. So we talked a little bit about some of the results of adverse childhood experiences. And so I'm going to take you through a couple of these slides and just show you how devastating these adverse experiences can be for individuals, and how devastating they are for us as a society, and how serious and far-reaching and long-term these effects are. So these graphs I'm about to show you will show you the symptoms, or what will happen for individuals who had 0 adverse childhood experiences, 1, 2, 3, or 4 or more. So we see that individuals who have experienced 4 or more adverse childhood experiences have a 20%, almost 20% chance of attempting suicide. We see that individuals who have experienced more adverse childhood experiences have an increased rate of taking up smoking cigarettes as an adult. Individuals with a high ACE score are likely to perpetuate domestic violence. So we know that individuals who have experienced trauma are often more vulnerable to domestic violence and becoming victims and being re-victimized, but they are also more likely to perpetuate or commit domestic violence. We also see that individuals with high ACEs scores see increased absenteeism, serious financial problems, and serious problems performing or keeping a job. Obviously, if you have problems with absenteeism and performing your job, that will create economic difficulties, which in turn can exacerbate traumatic circumstances or even create them. Your risk for developing alcohol use disorder or any substance use disorder increases with every adverse childhood experience or trauma exposure. So we see that the consequences for being exposed to trauma in early childhood or as a young adult or at any point in your life, the stakes are really, really high. And it isn't just something that affects an individual's internal life, it affects how they engage with the world. Again, it affects their behaviors. This is kind of my mantra at my job. A lot of times when students have difficult behaviors, teachers will come to me and ask for help. And I'm constantly reminding them that feelings become behaviors. Feelings become behaviors. If you can figure out what a student is feeling, you can probably figure out why they're acting a certain way. So feelings like fear, anxiety, sadness, guilt, confusion, anger, grief, and emotional blunting, all really common in people who have experienced trauma, can lead to behaviors such as hostility, irritability, dozing off, absenteeism, hypersensitivity. We also see that with trauma at the core, there's a huge number of symptoms that can be displayed. Whether or not you will develop these symptoms as a result of trauma is kind of up to the draw. What kind of trauma you experienced, what age you were, your personality type. But just some of the possible symptoms that can come from trauma exposure are intrusive memories or flashbacks, a startle response, so someone who is frightened very easily and maybe overreacts to being startled. These individuals can have a really intense sense of shame and self-hatred. They may experience panic or anxiety attacks, or just in general emotional overwhelm. There can be physical diseases such as chronic pain and headaches. They can develop eating disorders, substance abuse, self-destructive behaviors such as self-harm. Because of the changes that happen in the brain, exposure to trauma can also lead to having little or no memories of the event, things before the event or after. Hypervigilance, so constantly being aware, very jumpy. Disassociation, checking out, removing yourself mentally from a place and situation. Depression, irritability, loss of interest, numbing or blunting, insomnia, decreased concentration, hopelessness, and again, nightmares and flashbacks. So aside from dealing with the stress of a traumatic incident, the symptoms also kind of create their own sense of stress too. And the reality of individuals living in the aftermath of trauma, it's difficult. It really is. All right, so talking about this, those are the symptoms of trauma. Those are the ways that we see traumatic exposure played out in people's behavior and their bodies and their selves. Now I want to talk about the core experiences of trauma, and that's a little bit different. So whereas symptoms are things that are observable, either to people outside of the individual or to the individual themselves, core experiences are the after effects of trauma that the individual really holds deeply within themselves. And this is not something that you as an outsider will necessarily see or be privy or privileged to. So I want to start off actually by having us watch this video. Let me make sure I'm sharing my sound with you about what PTSD is really like. I could sit here and tell you about my own experience or maybe call on other people to talk about it, but I think that's kind of unfair. So I'm going to let BuzzFeed take care of that actually. All right. Leave computer audio. Okay. All right.
It's like
Can you hear the video okay out there? No. Oh, great. All right, let's try it again. Now I'm actually sharing my sound.
I was living in Japan during the earthquake in 2011.
A few weeks and months of political unrest while I was living overseas. We lived with bags by the door ready to go in case we needed to get out.
I found out in 2008 I had PTSD, complex PTSD, but I think the diagnosis should have probably been made when I was 14 years old.
I was raped, and as a result, I live with PTSD.
The civil war in Lebanon broke out in 1975. I was only 17 years old. I lived through that for about 12 years.
As it kind of sunk in, I started to feel really guilty because I had always associated PTSD with people who had been to war, and I just didn't think I deserved it.
The PTSD triggers, they ambush you. You don't know when it's gonna come. It's sort of the unknown. Every day you wake up and you don't know if you're going to have a trigger today.
I was at a movie, and there's a part where this woman got trapped in a car. I had a serious panic attack.
There was a song that was talking about like shooting and armed robbery, and just hearing that song, like, that was all it took.
Something happened when I was 13, and when my trigger happens, in that moment, I am 13.
Usually the sounds of jet planes overhead would trigger off the memory for me of those days. It would make me feel weak in the legs, and my memory will go back to that time trying to look after my children when they were little and protect them. Yeah, all I had to do is hear a jet plane and that's where my mind will go.
At times, it has literally felt like I'm dying. You feel like you're never gonna get past this. One of the things that's helped me a lot was group therapy. This happens to more people than you think.
Start to have a conversation with this thing that you have.
I did counseling for 2 years in college, and it felt like that got my life into a pretty manageable place.
I am trying to build up the courage to attend a support group.
I would have these days where you're just like, you know, there's nothing I can do to do anything that you're supposed to do. In group therapy, someone called it a lost day. It's such a simple thing, but putting the words lost day to those days helped me like overcome.
And I think accepting that is really important, and just being like, it's okay to like freak out and just be like, oh, this is scary, like, because it's scary.
And don't ever tell them to get over it because it's extremely painful.
It takes practice and it takes patience and it takes faith. You have to know that the fact that you've been through something so traumatic and you're here, you are much stronger than you think you are.
Don't feel guilty when you have a good day.
Give yourself time to heal.
You can't judge yourself for it.
It'll never be the same, but it can get better, and it's worth whatever it's gonna take. You can have a better life.
There is a light at the end of the tunnel. You just got to find the right thing that works for you.
And getting help is not a sign of weakness. It takes a lot of strength and a lot of courage, and you deserve the happiness that comes with getting better.
My name is Kate.
My name is Tammy.
My name is Kirk, and I live with PTSD.
Yeah, so I don't know if like is the right word, but as someone who also has PTSD, I really appreciate that video for kind of walking people who might not understand it through it pretty succinctly. So what we're going to talk about now is the core experiences that these individuals, that myself, anybody else with post-traumatic stress disorder or trauma exposure, more specifically, those feelings and internal landscapes. We'll talk about that now. So there are 5 core experiences of trauma, both for people who have been exposed to trauma. There is an internal sense of disempowerment, like feeling like you are no longer in control, that power has been taken away from you, that you're unable to move or help yourself, which plays into the next core experience, is a feeling of helplessness, that there's nothing that can be done. There's nothing that you could do, nothing that you could have done. The sense of being ineffective and not having any agency. There's also a really deep sense of disconnection, disconnection from yourself, maybe previous versions of yourself, disconnection from your family, from your community. Trauma exposure is a very isolating experience. There's also the core experience of the repetition of the past, not necessarily in the form of flashbacks or nightmares, but a lot of individuals with PTSD will project their past onto the future. Post-traumatic stress disorder can make, for example, forming new relationships very difficult because you project past red flags onto the current relationships. Another core experience of trauma is also lack of choice. Almost nobody would choose to put themselves into a situation where they could or will be traumatized. And so a lot of individuals, again, going with the disempowerment and helplessness, feel like they had no choice in the matter. They had no say, they had no voice. And many individuals feel like at that point, they lost their say, they lost their voice, and continually struggle to regain it or find it. So we're talking about these experiences with trauma. With disempowerment and helplessness, for me, what that looked like is a persistent and constant sense, even now, as I'm talking to you, of having nowhere to go and nothing to do. They're just being nothing. Nothing to do except wait. So waiting for circumstances beyond your control, feeling like authority has betrayed you, that God has betrayed you. There's also the sense of disconnection. For the longest time, I was prevented from sharing my experience openly and honestly. Part of it by structural barriers, part of it by context, and part of it by just not having the language to communicate what happened. And especially when we think about some learners, individuals for whom language is not English not their primary language, they can really struggle with this sense of disconnection, because not only are they not able to feel like they're part of a community, but they're not even able to share in ways that feel comfortable to them. And also the repetition of the past. Violence is cyclical. It tends to repeat itself in communities, in families, in structures. There's also a resurgence of historical trauma and triggers. So for myself as a Jewish individual, living with the historical trauma of, just that in general, certain political things over the past couple of years, both here and abroad, have been really triggering in that sense, and have created a sense of fear that maybe the past will repeat itself. And so these 5 experiences create a trauma loop for a lot of survivors, constantly thinking about how helpless they feel, how they don't feel like they have any choice. And so what that means for us as facilitators, individuals, leaders, is that our responsibility, our goal, our role is to help negate and turn around those core experiences of trauma, to challenge those narratives within those individuals. So we take these core experiences of trauma and we flip them and we turn them into core experiences of resiliency. Because the answer to surviving trauma, to surviving negative experiences, is to develop grit, resiliency. And so we take the core experience of disempowerment and we turn that into empowerment. We look to empower individuals with these core experiences. We take feelings of helplessness and we try to turn them into feelings of self-efficacy. So taking individuals from saying, I can't do this, I can't help myself, to taking that I can attitude. I am responsible for myself. I can take care of myself, creating and building confidence. We take that core experience of disconnection and we flip that into resiliency by building community. We help integrate the individual into communities, into places where they feel safe and welcome. With the repetition of the past, we counter that with mindfulness. So giving individuals tools and support to help them stay in the present moment. And with the core experience of lack of choice, we try to provide autonomy and choice. So again, a huge part of this is helping individuals move past trauma, is to re-empower them, to make them feel that they are not alone. This is not something that is just best left for the therapists and the psychiatrists and the mental health professionals. This is something that all of us can do with our students, with our clients, with our loved ones, with our friends. This is not just left for the shrinks. So, a quick summary on the symptoms and effects of trauma. So we know if the trauma exposure and adverse experiences have lifelong impacts up to and including early and premature death on overall health and wellness, including permanent chemical and structural changes to the brain. These impacts can be physical, psychological, or behavioral. Again, the experience of trauma causes physical changes to the brain. Is it all in your head? Yes, because your brain is in your head and your brain is structurally changing. We know that emotional dysregulation is a hallmark experience of trauma. That is something that you will see almost across the board with all survivors. We also know that feelings lead to behaviors. Negative feelings lead to negative behaviors. Positive feelings lead to positive behaviors. So I talk about problematic behaviors. This is a point that I will take to the grave with me, but I personally and strongly believe that behaviors and attitudes only become problematic when they clash with expectations. So behaviors in and of themselves, unless they're causing harm to another person, are not a problem. And also the core experience of trauma is one of profound disempowerment. All right, so taking a look at this summary and thinking about some of the core experience of trauma, I'm going to go ahead and set this timer. And I'll remember to stop it before it goes off and scares me and maybe scares you. but I'd like you to chat out some of your thoughts on these symptoms and effects, some of your own experience, any questions you have for me.
Well, obviously, we see the cycle of trauma with clients here at the task force. So, and the last slide about the how to combat the trauma kind of thing and re-empower people is a tough one, because you make progress and then you slide back, and then you make progress and then you slide back, and it's kind of frustrating for people who don't understand the trauma, or for the clients themselves who don't understand how the trauma actually changes them physiologically. That is something that isn't just something they can control necessarily. You can't control how your brain rewires. That's not your choice. So that kind of is, it can be helpful for them to understand that, and also kind of like, oh, great, another thing I can't control, you know? So it's kind of a double-edged sword there a little bit when we talk about that with, or when I talk about that with clients. On one hand, they like knowing that it's kind of off their like list of decisions they have to make. But on the other hand, it once again leads to that feeling of, you know, helplessness and lack of choice. So it's interesting.
Yeah, that's a really a great point about, you know, when you're talking about trauma and the effects of it, you know, it can be empowering to understand, you know, that you are a trauma survivor, to own that, and to own the things that come with that. But like you said, you know, the fact that trauma does make structural changes in your brain, that's just another, you know, lack of choice. Like, you know, not only did I not choose to be put in a traumatic situation, now I have to deal with a brain that's changing out of my control. And like I said, that is a double-edged sword, because on one hand, it can make you feel helpless to know that these changes are happening, you know, to you or to someone you love. But on the other hand, I think when we turn the conversation towards, yes, this is how your brain is, here are the things that we can do to help you and the modifications we can make. And I think a lot of that is handing back control as well too. Acknowledging that those structural changes have already been made. There's nothing you could have done to stop it. There's nothing you can do to stop it. So now what we have to do is make a decision to move forward, to create new experiences as well too. It says, many of my high school equivalency students feel that they have failed. So the advice to help them learn and how to learn is very powerful for me as a teacher. Another note, so many people have experienced trauma, so I will remember that. Yeah, you know, when you look at statistics, it's really hard to talk about who has actually experienced trauma. You know, we can get numbers about how many people have diagnosed PTSD, but how many people have obstacles and barriers that keep them from getting mental health care and diagnoses. There are people who do talk about their trauma exposure, and in a way we can measure that, but there are people who will never talk about it. There are people who didn't even know that they have been exposed to trauma. And so a conservative estimate that I saw from the World Health Organization 2 or 3 years ago estimated that 7 out of 10 adults had experienced at least one adverse childhood experience by the age of 25. So a pretty conservative number is at least 70% of people walking around are carrying some sort of trauma load with them. When we consider what people do not disclose, what people do not share, what people do not recognize, I personally estimate the rate is probably higher. Around 90% of individuals have had a traumatic experience. So yeah, it's not a rare thing. It doesn't make people into pariahs. Part of the reason I am so keen on trauma-informed practices is because I view adverse experiences and adversity as the lowest common denominator. you would be really hard pressed to find somebody who has not had a hard go of it at least one point in their life, who has not had something difficult or hard happen to them. And so when we seek strategies to address that trauma, to address those negative experiences, that is something that everyone can benefit from, because everybody has had a negative experience that they have carried with them. Whether or not it qualifies as an adverse childhood experience, whether or not it qualifies as trauma, doesn't matter. We all have a psychic load. We all have a psychic burden that we have to bear. Any other comments or questions before we move on? Going once, going twice, sold. I have a very fat cat, and she's laying on her back right now with her legs up in the air, and it is darling. I just wanted to tell all of you that. All right. Okay. So moving on to the next section, and I want to be mindful that we have enough time for Q&A and maybe even a little bit of time to get a couple minutes early. But one thing I want to make sure I get to before we leave today is talking about safety. So in terms of talking about trauma and safety, safety is the antithesis to a traumatic experience. When you are in the middle of an adverse experience, you feel fundamentally unsafe. It is those profound feelings of being unsafe that create the sense of trauma as well too. So our role as leaders, individuals, people in the community, human beings, is to create spaces, environments, contexts that prioritize safety. In order to do that, we have to have the same definition of what safety is. So before I change slides, how do you personally define safety? What does safety mean for you? How do you know when you're safe? Where are you safe? Tessa says she feels safe when things are calm around her. At home with familiar surroundings. Yeah.
For me, because of some dynamics in my home life growing up, I can find safety wherever I'm at. I just go within myself, and nobody knows that I put a big rock, big formation between me and everybody else, and I just live behind that. And people don't realize it, but I spend lots of my life there.
Yeah, safe is not always a place. Safe is sometimes just being safe within yourself. Yeah. Cassandra says, I find safety in patterns and things I know around people I trust. Yeah, so thinking about those answers, calm, familiar, things I know, familiarity, people I trust, within myself, putting up a wall, a formation. Yeah, those are things that create safety, that make us feel like we are not in danger. So in regards to trauma-informed practices, or just in general, when I talk about safety, safety is a combination of high structure and high warmth. So a safe environment is an environment where individuals know what to expect and what is expected of them. There are rules and structures, but individuals also feel welcome and accepted as well too. If we have an environment that has too much structure and not enough warmth, it can feel punitive or like punishment. Like prison is a very highly structured place. Every element of your day is controlled by somebody else, but there is very little warmth either in the person-to-person interactions or in the environment. If we have too little structure and too little warmth, that can create a neglectful environment where individuals don't know what's happening next. They don't know, they don't feel taken care of, they don't feel seen. If we don't have enough structure, but we have too much warmth, that can be kind of a chaotic experience. You know, the well-meaning teacher, the young nice teacher who doesn't have control of the classroom yet. But again, when we have the right mix of structure and warmth, we create a safe environment. Tessa says, we try to strike a balance of these when we shelter someone. It's difficult to do. Yeah, and especially because this sense of safety is not static. It's constantly sliding around. How individuals feel safe in a single environment, subtle changes in an environment can change the sense of safety. So yeah, it's really a nebulous term. You know, and each individual carries with them their own definition of safety. As we can see from the answers, everyone has different things that help them feel safe specifically. But we do know that to create a safe environment, if we have some structure and we have some warmth and care, most individuals will find some sense of calm or familiarity there. And while they may not completely engage, it will start to help them regulate. So some qualities of a safe environment. A safe environment incorporates the sequence of engagement. That's really what we're going to talk about tomorrow. The ways in which you as individuals and leaders will work through, you know, your own levels of your brain as well as others to help them become more engaged. Safe environments are also transparent. So leaders are very clear about changes that are happening. Individuals at all times kind of understand like what's going on, and that goes along with predictability again too. Individuals know what's going to happen next. There are no surprises, there are no shocks, there are no jump scares. Not to say that things are boring, but individuals have a sense of that they know what comes next, and they don't have to worry, they don't have to feel like they're standing at the ledge of a cliff. Safe environments provide choices, but choices within limits. A lot of individuals who have those profound senses of helplessness and lack of choice can become very easily overwhelmed when given too many choices. So much the same way when you're helping a toddler get dressed, you don't ask them, what do you want to wear today? Unless you want some pretty crazy combination. For the best results, you say, do you want to wear the blue dress or the red dress? So again, providing choice within limits. Also, the building of strong relationships and trust. Again, what that looks like depends on your own personality, the personality of the people you're with, the rules and procedures around things like that and codes of conduct. But again, focusing on building strong relationships and creating a sense of trust between yourself and clients and students or individuals. In a safe environment, the leaders are also aware of their own triggers. So we know that when individuals become triggered, they become dysregulated, unpredictable, and can inadvertently trigger other people. And so for us as leaders, we need to be aware of the things that trigger us so that we can step away from them, acknowledge them, and deal with them. Because if we were to inadvertently become triggered with our own traumas and our own burdens, we could end up perpetuating harm onto the very people that we're meant to help. It's also important to have helpful responses. That doesn't mean to say that you always have to have the right answer, but when you do engage with individuals and give them information, making sure that you're being helpful and not just nice or kind. And again, and being aware of the physical environment as well too. This is a huge element of safety. Oftentimes, when people think of safety, their first thought is the physical environment that they're in. And so doing your best as a leader to secure the physical environment, to at least secure physical safety, will go a long way. Emotional and cognitive safety takes a long time to develop, but securing a building, making it feel safe, making it feel quiet is something is pretty easy and fairly within our control. So I want to talk a little bit more about structure. And when we go into talking about resiliency routines, I will give you more information about how to create classroom structure or intake and orientation structure. But generally speaking, we know that when students know what to expect from you and what you expect from them, they're able to focus their attention on those tasks and behaviors instead of worrying about what may happen next. So when I teach when I teach all of my classes, but especially my faculty classes in the summer, I keep a posted schedule. I start the class with the schedule. We walk through it. I keep the schedule posted at the front of the classroom. Whenever we come back from breaks, we review the schedule. That way my students know exactly where we're at in the day. They know how much we've accomplished. They know what we're doing now, and they know how much they have left. There's never any questions of, oh, I wonder if there's going to be a writing workshop today. I hope not. I'm really scared. Students always know what's coming. I also make sure to communicate with students when we're going to have breaks. I encourage students to take breaks as they need them, but also I schedule a break so students, if they are having some sort of emotional response, they can use the knowledge that break is coming up to help regulate themselves. Okay, I'm stressed out, but if I can just hang on for 5 more minutes until the break, I'll be good. Again, so not just creating structure for your classroom, but communicating that structure to your students so they understand that there is a framework that they're existing within. All classroom experiences or all experiences in your organization should be well within the window of tolerance. So individuals should be appropriately challenged and engaged. So you don't want to create a situation where individuals are bored out of their minds because they're going to check out and disassociate. You also don't want to create a situation where students are overstimulated because they're also going to check out in different ways as well too. So again, providing that structure, students know what's coming. And we try really hard to keep the experiences, keep the classroom calm, but engaging. Talking about warmth, one of the core experiences of trauma is disconnection. And so what we can do as individuals is create an environment where people can foster those intra and interpersonal connections. It's not only encouraging individuals to connect with each other, building friendships, building working relationships, but to look inside themselves and improve the relationship they have with themselves as well too. This is something I took from a kindergarten teaching manual, but I love what it said. The concepts of good classroom design or good environment design, remember I'm a teacher, it's good classroom design. So design the environment well, develop listening skills, teach listening skills, teach and develop self-determination, and build class community. These are all things you can do to create warmth in the classroom. Even though this advice came from a kindergarten handbook, it's transferable across grade levels and contexts. If you do these things in your environment, students will feel warmth. Some of the pictures you see over here on the right-hand side are instances of times when I've been able to create a good class community. So in a previous position I was in, I was the director of a one-room schoolhouse for adult refugees and immigrants ages 65 and older. And we called ourselves the Little School. And we had students from Bolivia, Somalia, Ethiopia, just all over the world. I think we had like 15 countries represented at one point, all in this little room learning together. It was amazing. And prior to having class, we had community tea time. So every morning when the ladies and folks would come in, they would get together for an hour and they would sit and they would drink tea, coffee, and they would have snacks and they would talk. During that time, we had interpreters available. So our students weren't just talking to each other, Somali folks with Somali folks. They were able to communicate across language barriers, across generations. And some of the friendships that came out of that were just amazing to behold. We had one individual, Sarah, who was a refugee from South Sudan and just very severe traumatic load. And she built a really rich and deep relationship with one of our refugee women from Colombia. And they probably only both spoke maybe 4 words of English each. But through the interpreter, and just through being around each other every day, they started to develop this great relationship where they would just grab each other and start dancing in the hallways. And they learned each other's greetings. So, buenos dias, mal magua. And so again, creating opportunities for individuals to come together and create their own friendships as well. Another thing we did with that group of individuals is we found the funding to rent a charter bus and we took everybody up to the Minnesota Historical Society. We had 45 adult elders, students, teachers, and administrators. And we had myself as well as 3 Catholic postulants from Vietnam all go together. So a huge, diverse community. It was probably one of the best days of my life. Everybody brought a dish to share, to pass around on the bus. People were talking, people were laughing. A lot of the community building I do with the individuals I work with revolve around food, because I believe food is the thing that brings us all together. But there are so many things you can do to, to encourage community. And at the end of the day, I think people want to connect with other people. And if you just provide a venue and a safe place for them to do that and model what appropriate connection looks like, people will do that. People will find each other. So again, the takeaway: safety is high structure and high warmth. So what that looks like is, before we jump into the meat of the conversation, before I jump into teaching, before we jump into safety planning, we have to warm up the mind and the soul for learning. We have to get individuals ready and focused in a place where they can accept new information, where they can communicate with us. In a safe environment, leaders engage in direct and frequent communication. So you tell your students exactly what is happening. You are very transparent and open with them. Create and communicate routines. Like I said, it's not enough to just create a routine and have the routine in your head and say, okay, I know we're going to do this today. You have to share those routines with people. It's not enough that you know what's coming next. Everybody else in the environment also has to understand the routine so they can benefit from it. Remember to offer options. So when it's safe, possible, and appropriate, allow individuals to make choices about the things that affect them. And to build a community. So not just thinking about yourself and your workplace as a collection of people who just share the same space for 8 hours a day. Looking for ways to create intentional community with your coworkers, with your staff, with your clients, looking for small and big ways to connect. It's important to identify your triggers and your students' triggers. Once you identified your triggers and students' triggers, you can create an environment where those triggers are eliminated or minimized. So where people just feel safe by virtue of knowing that you care enough to make sure they're not triggered. And then you caring about yourself enough to make sure that you're not triggered and perpetuating harm on others. A safe environment is one that offers positive feedback, frequent positive feedback. Not to say that all your feedback has to be positive, but the majority of it should be. And with that positive feedback also goes a willingness to admit mistakes. Especially for us as leaders, it's very powerful for individuals to see us say, I made a mistake, because that's really scary for them to do. But if we model that type of bravery, we see that play out as well. And the last point is that physical safety is the most critical thing to guarantee and often the easiest. It's much easier to protect individuals from physical harm than it is to protect them from emotional or psychological harm. So anything you can do to physically secure the spaces you're meeting with people will go a long way in helping them feel secure and confident, like they can be there together. Okay, so what I want to do now is I'm going to skip through these slides really fast. And I'm going to go to the end slide. And I want to take a second to regroup before we kind of jump into a little bit more some direct discussion. Oh, and now my slideshow won't load. Okay, so let's just take maybe a minute or so to get up and maybe move around if you need to. I was gonna take a break at the hour point, but I forgot. Let's take a few moments to get up and move and breathe along with the GIF I have here. Breathe in on the expansion, hold your breath, and breathe out. Breathe in. All right. So now we've got everybody regulated, kind of downshifting into the next task. I want to check in with you. All right, I know how you were feeling on a scale of cat at the beginning of session. Now I want to know on a scale of fine art, how are you today? Are you a Bob Ross #1 Mona Lisa number 2, girl with a pearl earring number 3. How are you feeling now? All right. I think I may be doing the worst out of all of us at a 9. I'm feeling distinctly cubist and abstract right now. Got a couple of 2s. Good. Feeling peaceful and serene. I love that for you. Some 4s. Whistler's mother. Feeling calm. Maybe a 5. Tessa, I don't know what that means, but my thoughts are with you. Another 4 or a 1 to a 2. Good. I'm very happy to see no 6s or 7s. I would be very, very worried about you if you were checking in with a 6. 4. Good, good. So people are feeling all right. I like to hear that. Okay. So what I'd like to do now is we've got half an hour of the presentation left. So what I've mostly gone through is some of the definitions and symptoms and things like that. So what we'll talk about tomorrow is specifically what you can do in your own environments to create resiliency routines, to counter those core experiences of trauma and create core experiences of resiliency. But what I'd like to do now is I'm going to actually stop sharing and head back over to see all of your fabulous faces. Wow. And just take some time for discussion and Q&A. I really encourage you to ask any questions that have come up for you at this point, whether or not they directly relate to the content or not. I've often found that some of the best content from these presentations has come in the Q&A and discussions. So I want to make sure I left plenty of time for that. So again, opening the floor to questions about the materials, questions about trauma, anecdotes you have. One of the things I will challenge you to think about and not share here, but as you think about the types of individuals you work with, what types of trauma are pervasive in those communities? And again, feel free to share that, but don't feel obligated. So what kind of traumas do you see in the communities that you are working with? Think about what types of traumas, what are the symptoms of that trauma exposure for those individuals? How do you see some of those core experiences play out for those individuals?
In our dropout recovery program, numerous substance abuse issues in the family and within the individual students also by the time that they get to us. We generally have, not every session, but the majority of the sessions, we have at least 1 or 2 homeless kids that just couch surf, go from this friend's house till the parents won't have them there anymore to another's. Lots of having to be the parent for siblings because of the absence of the actual parent. There was just a few of numerous ones that we deal with. We serve about 20 to 25 young people a year, and we've been doing it for about 12 years now. So.
Yeah, those three that you mentioned, homelessness, especially chronic homelessness, the addiction, and the parentification of children, that's not, especially that last one, is not something we talk a lot about. How a lot of children are forced to step into the mature roles long before they're ready, which is also its own traumatizing experience in of itself. And I do want to add one thing that I have been thinking about this a lot lately and haven't incorporated into the presentation yet, but trauma is not just the things that happened to you. Sometimes they are the things that did not happen to you, the things that were missing from your life. So an absence of warmth or praise. Maybe your parents didn't put you down, but maybe they just didn't lift you up. That would be a form of trauma and absence. Yeah, Mike, thank you for sharing. What other types of trauma exposure or symptoms or behaviors are we seeing in the folks that we work with?
So Maron, we had a comment here from BOCES talking about political conflict and the trauma that's involved with that. I think that is something that's happening worldwide currently. So we wanted to just share that comment, especially where people feel that it's important to express their political views while carrying a rifle.
Yeah, that's a great point. Political trauma, civil trauma, government trauma is a thing that's really come to the forefront. It used to be that we associated, insurrection, protests, civil war, raiding, looting with things that happened other places, third world countries in a sense. But the realities of those types of traumas are becoming more and more immediate and more local. In Mankato, I'm only 60 minutes or thereabouts from the Twin Cities, where George Floyd was murdered. And so Minnesota, which is generally a pretty quiet, happy-go-lucky place, really got rocked last year, and seeing a huge resurgence of those kind of traumas as well too. During the protests and the uprising, I spent a lot of time in the cities providing psychological first aid to individuals in South Minneapolis. And going back in the time since then, a number of these individuals who live in the US, have never been anywhere else, are experiencing symptoms of trauma and core experiences that remind me a lot of my students that have come from areas of civil war. Yeah, and as time moves on and conditions change, we are going to see new types of trauma, things that we never thought were traumatic becoming traumatic as well too. So these criteria are constantly changing. And I would not be surprised that if they did another ACEs study in 2 or 3 years, if they would add another couple more criteria for adverse experiences. Absolutely. What kind of behaviors do you see with with individuals you work with? Or maybe even individuals in your own life? What kind of problematic behaviors have you seen?
What we see with our kids is a lack of belief in themselves.
Mm-hmm.
I've got an amazing teacher for these kids, and I often tell them that she's going to believe in you, and we're all going to believe in you until you believe in yourselves. And generally, after about 8 weeks of the 10-week, 12-week, maybe 7 weeks, it starts clicking on each one of them, and then we just get out of their way and they take off and flourish.
Mm-hmm.
I have had remove 2 kids out of it. All the years that we've had it, I've only had removed 2, one for threatening our teacher, just could not allow that back in. And we had this terribly raunchy sexual harassment issue just a couple sessions ago that we just had to let that kid go. We just could not have him there. But this, again, not that it was okay, but if you look at the life that these kids had come from, their behavior was totally reasonable for the context of their lives.
Mhm. That's a really great point, Mike, about that behavior being reasonable for the context of their lives. And that's why I'm not a big fan of calling behaviors problematic, because most of the behaviors you see individuals have, they develop those for a reason. Those are behaviors that kept them alive, or they kept them safe in a certain circumstance. Humans don't do things generally that don't work out for us. So if we're doing a behavior all the time and it never absolutely works, we're going to teach ourselves to stop doing that. So these behaviors that you're seeing, and the reasons they're so strongly embedded, because these behaviors are defensive things. They kept these individuals safe. And that's why some of these behaviors are so hard to extinguish, because if we get rid of the behavior before we create safety, we leave this individual feeling vulnerable and exposed. And that's a great point too about not excusing it. But again, going back to the cycle of violence, people who have experienced trauma, have experienced violence, have been victims themselves, are more likely to become victims again, but again, also more likely to become perpetrators of that violence. And so it's really important to see, like you said, where the behavior is coming from so you can better understand it. Yeah, thank you for sharing. Would anyone else care to share experiences regarding what we talked about? Or does anybody have any clarifying questions or follow-up questions they would like to ask me?
I don't mean to dominate, but you're talking about the change in the brain and the structural changes in the brain. I don't know if this is something that's covered tomorrow, but there are ways that might not change the structure, but you could change the way those brain chemicals are being produced. And there is a way out of this. It's not easy, especially if you're older when you start making the changes, but you could actually change how that brain is. When you look at a situation that used to have all kinds of cortisol and bad chemicals dump into your brain, you can start raising your serotonin levels with lifestyle changes.
Yeah, I don't get so much into the those fine point aspects of it, but you make a really good point that just because these structural changes have occurred, that's not to say that, you know, and the structural changes are permanent, but there are things you can do to mitigate, to reduce, to kind of to rewire your brain, to reset it as well too. Yeah, it's impossible to go back to where you were before the trauma. Just like with the previous example of Humpty Dumpty can't ever unbreak himself. But he can glue himself back together. He can get back up on that wall and he can keep sitting up there. Yeah. So it's possible to come back, but it takes work. Yeah, absolutely. Does anybody from the in-person group have anything to add, or any of the other advocates or volunteers that are joining today?
Simran, I just want to, I don't know, make a comment that it's difficult to balance trying to help, I don't know, center a student without inappropriate emotional involvement, you know. You want to hear, you want to talk to them, you want to listen to them, but you don't want to overstep the very difficult boundary between teacher and student. So it's something that I personally struggle with, because I want to, you know, I'm sure we all want to help our students. And yet we don't want to, I don't know, be overly personable, personal, I guess, personal is the word.
Yeah, that's a really great point. You know, and that goes back to that idea of safety being an equal measure of structure and warmth. If you create too much warmth, if you get too involved with students, too invested, that can also create an unsafe feeling environment as well too. Yeah, and talking about the trauma that is parentification of students, we have to be careful of our own parentification, becoming these students' parents. I'm actually going to pull up an image and share it with you. I work with an individual named Lucille Rosario, and she is a trauma-informed social worker with Minneapolis school districts. And she is, I mean, just one of the most brilliant people I know. And I'm privileged to present with her and consider her a friend. But she recently spoke to me about something called the trauma triangle. So let me go ahead and share my screen with you real quick here. Okay. So this is the trauma triangle, and these are the roles that individuals who are involved in traumatic events often find themselves falling into. So we've talked a lot about individuals who are victims, people who have had these adverse experiences. But people are very rarely confined to just the role of victim. We often slide into and step out of different roles and circumstances. So many of the things that we're talking about now is people who have been victimized often tend to step into the role of rescuer because they want to help others from becoming traumatized and stop what happened to them from happening to others. And it's very easy for especially a lot of us in these helping roles to get stuck in that rescuer mindset. Not only is our job to be a rescuer, but we care about the people we work with. That's why we're in these fields. We get a lot of value in ourselves from being rescued. We get a lot of satisfaction from the rescuing, and that's fine. But when that becomes your whole identity, you will have issues with full self-integration. On the other side of that, sometimes we become the perpetrator or the persecutor, and we create violence. So again, for a number of us who are at the top of organizations, or a number of us who belong to dominant power structures, being white, straight, Christian, cis, het, that puts us in a position where it's very easy to perpetuate violence, even if we don't mean to. Microaggressions are a form of violence. Again, being triggered can cause you to perpetuate violence. And so very rarely do people become victimized and stay victimized. There's this constant exchange of roles. Sometimes you are the victim and you feel scared and small. Sometimes you are the rescuer. You are the person that you wish would have been there for you. And sometimes you are the perpetrator of violence. Sometimes you are the bad guy. And to be stuck in any one of these aspects of the trauma triangle is not healthy. But what is healthy and normal is a constant exchange and flow between the three, and being aware of it as well too. Tessa says, as an advocate, I struggle with vicarious trauma. Yes, that is something that I wasn't planning to talk about in this presentation, but I might amend tomorrow's to kind of touch on it. But the idea of, even though we haven't directly encountered the trauma, by virtue of being around traumatized individuals, by hearing their stories, by seeing the ways they suffer, that we can in fact become traumatized in a way too. And that vicarious trauma is also tangentially related to compassion fatigue and burnout, which is a huge risk for us, especially those of us who are stuck in rescuer mode. You can't fill from an empty cup. And if you continue to give and serve and allow your emotions to be, to share your emotions without receiving emotions back, you'll get burnt out and you won't be able to be as good or effective as your job. And individuals who suffer high rates of burnout or frequent burnout often end up developing trauma around their job or around their position or around their role as a rescuer as well too. So again, sometimes we perpetuate trauma on others. Sometimes we re-traumatize ourselves. All right, so we're at 8:20, 7:20 for you folks. So about 10 scheduled minutes left. So if anybody has any questions, or if you have any suggestions or topics that you want to make sure I touch on tomorrow, please go ahead and let me know that now. I want to make sure that I'm giving all of you what you need, and that you want, what you need to get from this presentation. Okay, well, while I wait for any messages to maybe filter in, I just want to say, just for the first half of this presentation, talking about defining trauma, defining safety, and symptoms and core experiences, I just want to thank you for sticking with me and having great questions and feedback. I really appreciate it. Part of what makes this process of presenting and sharing so satisfying is the people I get to meet and how much I get to learn. I'm really blessed to have opportunity to share what I know and also learn more from all of you. So I'm glad you're here, and I can't wait to get into some more of the solutions tomorrow. Today we talked about the problem, but I'm really looking forward to sharing with you changes that we can make to help individuals with this exposure. So
I would just like to add thank you again to Moran for providing this presentation, and we will, if anyone has any questions, or we will, I think, conclude tonight's event, and we'll see you all again tomorrow night, I hope.
thank you so much, everyone. I'll see you tomorrow. Friends, do you need anything else from me today?